The October rain hammered against the windows of Emma's bookstore. With the persistence of an old friend who refused to take no for an answer, she glanced at the antique clock, hanging above the poetry section, nearly 9 o'clock, well past closing time, but she couldn't bring herself to flip the sign and lock the door. Something about stormy nights made her reluctant to shut out the world, as if the rain might wash away someone who needed the warm glow of her shop windows. Emma Chen had inherited more than just the bookstore from her grandmother Grace. She'd inherited the woman's fierce compassion and an uncanny ability to sense when the universe was about to deliver something unexpected to her doorstep. Tonight, as she arranged the last of the new releases and listened to the storm's symphony, she felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd had the morning her grandmother passed, the day she'd met her college roommate, the afternoon she'd decided to quit her corporate job and dedicate her life to books. The bell above the door chimed, though she was certain she'd locked it an hour ago. Emma looked up from her inventory sheets to see a figure silhouetted against the rain-soaked street. Water dripped from a threadbare coat that had seen better decades, and wild gray hair clung to a weathered face that spoke of too many nights spent under bridges and in doorways. "I'm sorry," Emma said gently, setting down her pen. "We're actually closed for the evening." The man didn't move immediately. He stood there, swaying slightly, and Emma realized he wasn't just wet, he was exhausted in the bone-deep way that suggested he'd been fighting battles long before tonight's storm arrived. His eyes, though clouded with fatigue, held an intelligence that made her reconsider her automatic response to send him away. "Just wanted to get out of the rain for a minute," he said, his voice carrying the rough texture of someone who'd spent years talking to himself more than to other people. "Didn't mean to bother anyone." Emma found herself walking toward him instead of away, drawn by something she couldn't name. Up close, she could see that beneath the grime and the desperate circumstances, this was a man who'd once commanded respect. His posture, even bent by hardship, suggested military bearing. His hands, though dirty and scarred, moved with the precise economy of someone who'd been trained to handle delicate equipment. "You're not bothering anyone," she said, reaching for the towel she kept behind the counter for rainy days. "Here, at least dry off a bit." When he reached for the towel, their fingers brushed, and Emma felt something electric pass between them, not romantic attraction, but recognition of a deeper sort, the kind of instant connection her grandmother had always insisted existed between people who were meant to find each other. "Thank you," he said, and she heard decades of careful manners buried under years of survival instinct. "You're very kind. Are you hungry?" The question escaped before Emma's practical side could remind her about safety protocols and the wisdom of keeping appropriate distance from strangers. "I've got some soup in the back, left over from lunch." He looked at her with surprise that gradually shifted into something that might have been hope. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You're not imposing. I hate eating alone anyway." Emma disappeared into the small kitchen area behind the store, heating the container of tomato soup she'd barely touched earlier. When she returned with a steaming mug and a sleeve of crackers, she found him studying the framed photographs she kept on the counter, pictures of her grandmother, her parents, and various bookstore events over the years. "Beautiful woman," he said, pointing to a black and white photograph of Grace from the 1940s. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." Emma felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the strange currents that seemed to be pulling this encounter in directions she couldn't predict. "That's my grandmother Grace. She passed away 2 years ago." The man's hand froze halfway to the soup mug. His entire body went still, and Emma watched the color drain from his already pale face. "Grace," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace Whitmore. You knew her." Emma's pulse quickened. Her grandmother had been something of a local institution, known for her charitable work and her uncanny ability to help people find exactly the books they needed to heal whatever was hurting them. It wasn't impossible that this man might have encountered her at some point. Instead of answering directly, his eyes fixed on something at Emma's throat. She followed his gaze and realized he was staring at the delicate silver locket she always wore, her grandmother's locket, the one piece of jewelry Grace had insisted Emma take before she died. "May I?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange urgency. Emma found herself nodding, though every instinct she'd developed about personal safety was screaming warnings. She leaned forward, allowing him to examine the locket without removing it. From her neck, his fingers, surprisingly gentle despite their rough appearance, traced the intricate engraving on the silver surface. Victorian era, he murmured, probably 1890s, based on the filigree work. There's a small dent on the back left corner, and the chain was replaced sometime in the 1960s because the original broke during a move. Emma's breath caught. Everything he'd said was exactly right, down to details she'd never mentioned to anyone except her closest friends. How could you possibly know that? The man's eyes met hers, and she saw tears gathering in their depths. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of regret and loss and love that had never found its proper destination. Because I gave this to my daughter before I left for the war, he said. I gave it to Grace Whitmore in 1967, the night before I shipped out to Vietnam. I told her to keep it safe until I came home to marry her. The soup mug slipped from Emma's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor and sending ceramic shards and tomato soup across the space between them, but neither of them moved to clean up the mess. Emma stared at this homeless stranger who claimed to know the most intimate details of her grandmother's jewelry, who spoke of giving gifts to a woman who'd been married to Emma's grandfather for over 40 years. That's impossible, she whispered. My grandmother was never engaged to anyone except my grandfather James. She married him in 1968. Right after high school, James, the man repeated, and Emma heard a lifetime of complicated emotions in that single word. Yes, I suppose she would have married James. He was always the safer choice, the one who stayed home instead of running off to war like an idealistic fool. Emma felt the world tilting around her, as if the storm outside had somehow gotten inside her chest and was rearranging everything she thought she knew about her family history. Who are you? The man straightened, and for a moment she could see the soldier he must have once been. The young man who'd been confident enough to promise marriage to the most beautiful girl in town. My name is Marcus Vale, he said, and if what you're saying is true, if Grace Whitmore was your grandmother, then I think, he stopped, swallowing hard before continuing, I think that makes me your grandfather. Emma spent the night staring at her ceiling, replaying Marcus's words until they wore grooves in her mind like a broken record. I think that makes me your grandfather. She'd given him her couch, some clean clothes that belonged to her ex-boyfriend, and a hot meal, but she hadn't been able to give him the belief he seemed to desperately need from her. The next morning found her sitting across from Marcus at her small kitchen table, watching him eat scrambled eggs with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to waste food. In daylight, cleaned up and wearing clothes that fit, he looked less like a homeless wanderer and more like someone's father, someone's grandfather, who'd simply lost his way. Tell me about the war, Emma said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug for warmth she didn't really need. Marcus set down his fork and studied her face as if trying to memorize it. Vietnam was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, maybe a year. I was young and stupid and convinced that serving my country would make me worthy of Grace's love. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I proposed to her the night before. I left, gave her that locket, and told her we'd have the biggest wedding Portland had ever seen when I got back, but you didn't come back. I did, Marcus said quietly, 3 years later, after spending 18 months as a prisoner of war. But by then, Grace had already married James, had your father, built a life that didn't include room for a ghost. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. You came back and she was already married. The army had declared me killed in action. No body recovered, but enough evidence to satisfy the bureaucrats, who needed to close cases and move on to fresh casualties. Marcus pushed eggs around his plate without eating them. I can't blame her for believing them. Hell, there were days in that bamboo cage when I believed them myself. So you just left. When you found out she'd moved on, Marcus's smile was devastating in its sadness. What was I supposed to do? Show up at her door and demand she abandon her husband and child for a man who'd been dead on paper for 2 years? Grace had always been practical, even when we were teenagers. She chose stability over uncertainty. James over me. I convinced myself she'd made the right decision. Emma studied this man who claimed to be her grandfather, searching his weathered features for traces of her father's face, her grandmother's stories, anything that might serve as proof or contradiction. Where have you been all these years? Everywhere. Nowhere. I couldn't settle down knowing Grace was here, building a life with someone else. So I became a drifter, construction work, odd jobs. Whatever kept me moving and kept me from thinking too much about what I'd lost. Marcus met her eyes. I've been back in Portland for about 6 months. Couldn't stay away anymore, but couldn't bring myself to make contact either. Then last night, the storm, your bookstore. Seeing that locket, you recognized it immediately. I saved for 3 months to buy that locket. Went to every antique store in the city until I found something worthy of the woman I wanted to marry. I know every scratch, every imperfection, every detail of its construction. Marcus reached across the table, stopping just short of touching Emma's hand. I know it sounds impossible, but wearing it, you look so much like she did at your age. The same eyes, the same stubborn set to your chin when you're thinking hard about something. Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This is crazy. You're asking me to believe that my grandmother had some epic love story she never told anyone about. That she married my grandfather as a second choice. That you're my real grandfather who's been living on the streets instead of being part of our family. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Marcus said gently. I'm just telling you what happened. What I remember. How I ended up as a stranger studying your grandmother's photograph. In your bookstore instead of bouncing grandchildren. On my knee. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of morning traffic. Emma studied Marcus's face, searching for evidence of deception or delusion, but found only exhaustion and a grief so deep. It seemed to have become part of his cellular structure. There's someone you should meet, Emma said finally, Rose Palmer. She lives next door, and she was my grandmother's best friend since childhood. If anyone would know about you, it would be her. An hour later, Emma found herself standing on Rose Palmer's front porch with a man who might or might not be her grandfather, watching the elderly woman's face cycle through shock, disbelief, and something that looked suspiciously like recognition. Marcus. Vale, Rose whispered, her wrinkled hand flying to her throat. Dear God, we thought you were dead. Rose, Marcus's voice cracked. You always were too smart for your own good. Rose opened the door wider, ushering them into a living room that smelled like lavender and old photographs. Emma, sweetheart, sit down. You're going to need to. You knew him, Emma asked, though Rose's reaction had already answered the question. Knew him, honey. I was supposed to be the maid of honor at their wedding. Rose settled into her favorite armchair, studying Marcus with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. Grace was heartbroken when they told us you'd been killed. Absolutely devastated. She wore black for 6 months and barely spoke to anyone, but she married grandfather James. Not right away, Rose said carefully. James had been in love with Grace since high school, but she'd never seen him as anything more than a friend. When Marcus died, when we thought Marcus had died, James was patient, gentle. He helped her through the grief, never pushed, just waited. Marcus had gone very still. How long? 2 years, Rose said. She wore your ring on a chain around her neck for 2 years before she finally accepted James's proposal. Even then, she kept the locket, wore it every day until the day she died. Emma felt the world spinning around her again. She was engaged to you, actually engaged. We were young and desperately in love, Rose said when Marcus seemed unable to speak. Your grandmother used to say that Marcus was her grand passion, the kind of love that comes once in a lifetime and burns so bright it changes everything it touches. Then what was my grandfather James? Rose smiled sadly. James was her sanctuary, her safe harbor, the man who loved her enough to marry her even knowing he'd never be her first choice, who raised your father with patience and kindness, who gave Grace the stable, peaceful life she needed to heal from losing Marcus. But I came back, Marcus said hoarsely. I came back and she was already married and pregnant, and I couldn't destroy that for her. You came back. Rose's eyes widened. When? Why didn't you? 1970. I stood outside the house for 3 hours, watching through the windows as she fed your father his bottle, as James helped her with dinner, as they looked like the perfect little family they'd become. What was I supposed to do? Rose, march up to the door and demand she choose between the life she'd built and the ghost of the boy she used to love? Rose was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she processed decades of misunderstanding and loss. Marcus, she never stopped loving you, even after she married James. Even after your father was born, she used to sit in the garden and tell me stories about the boy who'd promised to come home and marry her. She kept your letters, read them over and over until they fell apart. She kept my letters, every single one, hidden in a box in her closet that James pretended not to know about because he understood that some kinds of love don't die just because life gets complicated. Emma felt like she was drowning in revelations, each new piece of information reshaping everything she thought she knew about her family. Where are the letters now? Rose stood slowly, moving toward an old secretary desk in the corner of the room. Grace gave them to me before she died, said she couldn't bear to throw them away but couldn't leave them for James to find. After she was gone, she made me promise to keep them safe in case. Rose pulled out a small wooden box tied with a faded blue ribbon, in case someday they might matter to someone. Marcus stared at the box as if it contained explosives. I can't read those now. It would kill me. Then I'll read them, Emma said, surprised by her own determination. I'll read them and you can tell me if the person who wrote them is the same person sitting in my kitchen eating scrambled eggs. As Rose handed over the box with shaking hands, Emma realized she was about to discover whether the stranger who'd stumbled into her bookstore was really her grandfather or just a broken man clinging to a story that made his suffering feel meaningful. Either way, she suspected her family's history was about to be rewritten entirely. The letters were love in liquid form, poured onto paper with the desperate intensity of a young soldier who understood that words might be all he could leave behind. Emma sat in Rose's living room, reading aloud while Marcus paced by the window, and Rose dabbed at her eyes with tissues that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of emotion filling the small space. My dearest Grace, Emma read from the first letter, dated March 1967. I know I promised to write every day, but the mail situation here is unpredictable at best. Some days I write 3 letters that never get sent, and other days I get 5 letters from you all at once, like Christmas morning in the middle of hell. Marcus stopped pacing. I wrote that after my first week in country. I was still naive enough to think the war would be organized, that mail would run on schedule, that anything about Vietnam would make sense. Emma continued reading, her voice growing softer as the letters progressed through months of separation, homesickness, and a love that seemed to grow stronger with distance. Marcus's younger self had written about everything: the landscape, his fellow soldiers, the letters from home that kept him sane, and always, his plans for their future together. I've been thinking about our wedding, Emma read from a letter dated August 1967. I know you want something simple, but Grace, when I get home, I want to marry you in the biggest, most beautiful ceremony Portland has ever seen. I want everyone to know that I'm the luckiest man alive because you chose me. She did want something simple, Rose said quietly. Grace always said she'd be happy getting married in the courthouse as long as she was marrying the right person. I bought something for you today, Emma continued from the next letter. A silver locket from an antique dealer in Saigon who swore it was made in London in the 1890s. It's not much, but it's beautiful, and when I saw it, I could picture it around your neck on our wedding day. I'm sending it with this letter, along with all my love and the promise that I'm coming home to you no matter what. Emma's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat. Marcus had stopped pacing entirely, standing frozen by the window as if he were afraid that moving might shatter the fragile connection being rebuilt through words written 55 years ago. The letters continued through the autumn of 1967, filled with wedding plans, dreams of children, and detailed descriptions of the house Marcus wanted to build for Grace when he returned. But then, in December, the tone shifted abruptly. Grace, I don't know how to tell you this, but our unit is being reassigned to a classified operation. I can't tell you where or when or how long, only that I might not be able to write for a while. If you don't hear from me, don't worry. Just keep wearing that locket and remember that I love you more than I ever thought. It was possible to love another person. That was the last letter, Rose said. Grace waited 6 months before the Army finally told her you'd been killed in action. Classified operation, Marcus said bitterly. Secret mission that went wrong in every possible way. Half my unit dead, the other half captured, and me spending the next 18 months in a bamboo cage learning that hell is a real place. You can visit while still breathing. Emma looked up from the letters. What happened? During those 18 months, Marcus sat down heavily, suddenly looking every day of his 70-odd years. Prisoner of war camp in the mountains. The North Vietnamese weren't particularly interested in following Geneva Convention protocols. Some days they forgot to feed us. Other days they forgot we were human beings instead of practice targets for interrogation. Techniques. How did you survive? Grace, Marcus said simply. I had this fantasy that I'd tell her stories about everything I'd seen, everything I'd survived, and somehow the telling would make it all worthwhile. I wrote letters to her in my head every day. Long conversations about the wedding we'd have, the children we'd raise, the ordinary life we'd build together. Rose reached for another tissue. She used to do the same thing. Write letters to you that she never sent, telling you about her job at the library, about helping your mother with the grocery store, about the wedding dress she'd already picked out. By the time I escaped and made it back to American forces, the war was winding down and I'd been declared dead for over a year. The Army debriefed me, gave me medical treatment, and basically suggested I start over somewhere else rather than trying to reclaim a life that had moved on without me. But you came back to Portland anyway. Not immediately. I spent 2 years trying to follow their advice, drifting around the country, taking jobs that didn't require explanations or background checks, but I couldn't stop thinking about Grace, wondering if she'd kept the locket, if she still remembered the boy who'd promised to come home and marry her. Emma found herself crying as she read the final letters in the box notes Grace had written to Marcus after receiving news of his death, letters she'd never intended to send but had needed to write in order to process her grief. My darling Marcus, Emma read through tears. They tell me you're gone, but I can't make myself believe it. Not when I can still feel you with me every time I touch the locket you sent. Not when I wake up every morning expecting to find a letter from you telling me. This has all been a terrible mistake. She loved you, Emma whispered. Even after she married James, even after she had my father, she never stopped loving you. And I never stopped loving her, Marcus replied. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes timing matters more than feelings. Sometimes the practical choice is the right choice, even when it breaks your heart. Rose stood slowly, moving to a cabinet filled with photo albums and memory boxes. There's something else you should see, she said, pulling out a leather-bound album. Grace made me promise to show this to you if you ever came back. The album was filled with photographs spanning 50 years Grace and James's wedding, Emma's father as a baby, family vacations, birthdays, graduations, and grandchildren. But scattered throughout were older photos that told a different story. Grace at 18 wearing the silver locket, Grace and Marcus at a school dance. Grace reading one of Marcus's letters with tears in her eyes. She kept pictures of you? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. She kept everything, Rose said. Pictures, letters, even the movie ticket from your first date. She told me once that she needed to remember that the great love of her life had been real, that it hadn't just been a dream she'd invented to make ordinary life feel less ordinary. Emma studied a photograph of her grandmother at 20, wearing the same locket Emma wore now, standing in the garden behind the house where Emma's father had grown up. Grace's expression was one of quiet hope mixed with patient waiting, the look of a woman who believed that love could conquer distance and time and war itself. She waited for you, Emma said, even after she married James. Part of her was still waiting for you to come home. Marcus traced Grace's face in the photograph with one finger. And I spent 50 years believing she'd forgotten me entirely, that I was just a youthful mistake she'd corrected by marrying a better man. James was a good man, Rose said carefully. He loved Grace completely and raised your father with kindness and patience. but he always knew he was sharing her heart with a ghost. I think it made him try harder, love deeper, appreciate what he had instead of taking it for granted. My father, Emma said suddenly. Does he know about any of this? Rose and Marcus exchanged a look that suggested this question had complicated answers. Your father knows his mother had a life before James, Rose said carefully. But Grace made me promise never to tell anyone about the letters or the photographs, or the fact that her first love might not have died in Vietnam after all. She said some secrets were too dangerous to share, that they could destroy the good life she'd built trying to honor the memory of the life she'd lost. Emma felt the weight of generations of secrets settling on her shoulders. In the space of 24 hours, she'd discovered a grandfather she'd never known existed, learned that her grandmother's great love story was even more complicated than she'd imagined, and realized that her family's entire history would need to be rewritten around truths that had been hidden for half a century. What happens now? She asked, looking between Marcus and Rose. What do we do with all of this? Marcus closed the photo album gently, as if it contained precious things that might break if handled roughly. Now you go home and decide whether telling your father the truth will heal old wounds or create new ones. And he paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever came next. I figure out whether it's possible to build a relationship with a granddaughter I never knew I had, or whether I'm too broken by 50 years of regret to be the kind of grandfather you deserve. Emma stood, still clutching the wooden box of letters. You're coming home with me tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to call my father and explain why his daughter's homeless friend knows intimate details about his mother's jewelry, and then we're going to figure out what it means to be a family that's been scattered by war and secrets and bad timing. As they prepared to leave Rose's house, Emma realized she was about to introduce her father to the grandfather he'd never met, the man who should have been part of their family all along, but who'd been lost to bureaucratic mistakes and painful choices that had echoed through 5 decades of separate lives. Emma's father, David Chen, had inherited his mother's practical nature and his stepfather James's steady temperament, which meant he approached unexpected revelations with the same methodical care he brought to his work as an accountant. When Emma called to invite him and her mother Linda for dinner to meet someone important, he'd assumed she was finally ready to introduce them to a serious boyfriend. He hadn't expected to find a weathered stranger sitting at his daughter's kitchen table, wearing clothes that looked borrowed and an expression that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Dad, Mom, Emma said, her voice betraying none of the nervousness she felt. I'd like you to meet Marcus Vale. He has some connections to our family that I think you'll want to hear about. David shook Marcus's hand with polite reservation, noting the firm grip and the way the older man met his eyes directly despite whatever discomfort he was obviously feeling. Linda offered the warm smile she extended to all of Emma's friends, already moving toward the kitchen to help with dinner preparations. Marcus was a friend of Grandma Grace's, Emma continued, ignoring the sharp look her father gave her at the past tense reference. From before she married Grandpa James, they knew each other quite well. The careful phrasing didn't fool David. His mother had been circumspect about her life before marriage, but he'd always sensed there were stories she'd chosen not to share. Looking at Marcus, seeing something familiar in the set of his shoulders and the shape of his hands, David felt the first stirring of suspicion about where this conversation might be heading. How well? He asked quietly. Marcus had been dreading this moment since Emma had suggested the dinner invitation. He'd spent 3 days cleaning himself up, practicing explanations that sounded less insane than the truth, and trying to prepare for the possibility that David might reject him entirely. Once he understood the implications of their meeting, we're engaged, Marcus said simply. Your mother and I were planning to marry when I returned from Vietnam, but I was reported killed in action, and by the time I made it home 3 years later, she'd already married James and had you. The kitchen went completely silent. Linda stopped stirring the pot on the stove. David sat down heavily, studying Marcus's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been missing crucial pieces. You're saying you're my biological father? David said finally. No, Marcus replied quickly. James was your father in every way that mattered. He raised you, loved you, taught you how to be a good man. I'm just the ghost your mother thought she'd buried before she moved on with her life." But biologically, Marcus met David's eyes steadily. "Your mother and I were close. Before I left for the war, when I came back in 1970 and saw you, you would have been about the right age. But David, I never asked for confirmation and your mother never offered it. Some questions are too dangerous to answer." Emma watched her father process this information, seeing him cycle through shock, confusion, and something that might have been relief at finally understanding some of the mysteries that had always surrounded his mother's early life. She kept "Your picture," David said suddenly. "Mom had a photograph hidden in her jewelry box of a young soldier she said was just a friend who died in the war. I found it once when I was about 12 and asked her about it. She got this look on her face like I'd opened a door she'd thought was locked forever. She kept pictures." "One picture," David corrected. "You in uniform. Probably right before you left for Vietnam. She used to look at it sometimes when she thought no one was watching, especially around Memorial Day or Veterans Day." Linda had abandoned the stove entirely, sitting down across from Marcus with the direct approach that had served her well through 30 years of marriage and motherhood. "Tell us what happened, all of it, from the beginning." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus told his story again: the engagement, the war, the imprisonment, the return to find Grace married and settled. David listened with the careful attention he brought to complex financial statements, occasionally asking questions that revealed how much he'd wondered about the gaps in his mother's history. "She never talked about life before Dad," David said. "I mean, she mentioned high school, her job at the library, helping Grandma with the store. But never boyfriends, never dates, never anything that suggested she'd had a romantic life before meeting James." "Your mother was protecting everyone," Marcus said. "Me, James, you, herself. She built a good life on the ruins of the life she'd planned to have, and she didn't want to jeopardize that by dwelling on what might have been." "But you came back," Linda said. "You were alive. Why didn't you fight for her?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain decisions that had seemed obvious at the time, but looked increasingly questionable in retrospect. "Because she was happy," he said finally. "Because James loved her completely and was raising David with kindness and patience. Because I was broken in ways that took years to heal, and Grace deserved stability instead of chaos." "Were you broken?" David asked. "From the war?" "Prisoner of war for 18 months, torture, starvation, psychological manipulation designed to break down everything I believed about myself and my country. When I finally escaped, I was—" Marcus paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like self-pity. "I was not the same person who'd promised to come home and marry your mother. I was damaged, angry, confused about everything except the fact that I still loved her." Emma had been listening to this conversation with growing understanding of the impossible choices that had shaped her family's history. "So you stayed away to protect her?" "I stayed away because I thought it was the noble thing to do, the self-sacrificing gesture that would let her keep the life she'd built while I dealt with my own demons somewhere else." Marcus laughed bitterly. 50 years later, "I'm not sure it was noble as much as it was cowardly. It was both," David said quietly, "and it was probably the right decision at the time, even if it caused pain for everyone involved." The conversation continued through dinner, with Marcus sharing stories about Grace's personality that illuminated aspects of David's mother he'd never fully understood: her fierce loyalty, her tendency to worry about people she cared about, her habit of keeping important things private rather than burdening others with her concerns. "She used to sing while she cooked," Marcus said, smiling at a memory that seemed to surprise him with its clarity. "Nothing fancy, just whatever was on the radio. But she had this way of humming harmony lines that made even mundane songs sound beautiful. She did that until the day she died," Linda said. "David used to tease her about it, but I always loved hearing her singing while she worked in the kitchen. And she collected books she never had time to read," Marcus continued, always saying she'd get to them someday when life settled down enough to allow for leisurely reading. "That's where Emma gets it," David said, looking at his daughter with new understanding. "The bookstore, the need to surround herself with stories. The way she seems to know exactly what book someone needs before they know it themselves. Emma felt tears threatening as she realized how many of her own quirks and passions could be traced back to a grandmother who'd carried her first love's influence through decades of marriage to another man. What happens now? Linda asked, voicing the question they'd all been avoiding. Where do we go from here? Marcus looked around the table at these people who'd welcomed him, despite the chaos his presence represented, who'd listened to his story without judgment and accepted the possibility that their family tree was more complicated than they'd imagined. I'd like to get to know my granddaughter, he said carefully, and if you're willing, I'd like to be part of this family in whatever way makes sense. I'm not trying to replace anyone or rewrite history. I'd like to stop being a ghost haunting the edges of a life I should have been part of all along. David studied Marcus for a long moment, seeing something in the older man's face that reminded him of his own reflection. A certain stubbornness around the eyes, a way of holding his head when he was thinking through difficult problems. You can start by staying for dessert, David said, and then we'll figure out how to introduce you to your great-grandchildren without traumatizing them with the news that their family history just got significantly more complicated. As Linda served coffee and the store-bought pie she'd brought as backup dessert, Emma realized that healing didn't always look like dramatic reconciliations or perfect resolutions. Sometimes it looked like ordinary people making room at their table for someone who'd been lost for too long, accepting that love could survive decades of separation and that families could be rebuilt even when the original blueprints had been scattered by war and time and impossible choices. Marcus was home, not the home he'd planned 60 years ago, but the home that was possible now, with people who understood that some stories took generations to finish properly. 6 months later, Emma stood behind the counter of her expanded bookstore, watching Marcus help a young veteran find books about transitioning to civilian life. The Veterans Corner had been Marcus's idea, a quiet section with comfortable chairs, resources for former military personnel, and twice-weekly support groups that met after hours. The trick, Marcus was saying to the 20-something Marine who'd been struggling with nightmares, is finding stories that remind you that other people have walked through hell and found their way back to something resembling normal life. Emma smiled, remembering how different Marcus had looked that first rainy night. Clean clothes, regular meals, and the purpose that came from helping others had transformed him from a broken stranger into the grandfather she'd never known she needed. He'd moved into a small apartment above the bookstore's storage room, paying rent by managing the veterans program and handling repairs that Emma's artistic temperament wasn't equipped to tackle. The bell above the door chimed, and Thomas Reed entered with the easy confidence that had attracted Emma's attention. When he'd first come to interview Marcus about his story, Thomas was a journalist for the local weekly paper, specializing in human interest stories that revealed the extraordinary circumstances hidden within ordinary lives. How's the grandfather business? Thomas asked Marcus, who'd become something of a local celebrity after Thomas's series of articles about his return from the dead. Exhausting. Marcus replied with the grin that still surprised Emma with its warmth. David's kids ask more questions than a congressional investigation committee, and they're not satisfied with vague answers about where Grandpa Marcus has been all their lives. What do you tell them? The truth, adjusted for age-appropriate consumption. That sometimes adults make decisions that seem right at the time, but create problems that take decades to fix. That love is more complicated than fairy tales suggest, but also more durable than most people realize. Emma watched Thomas and Marcus together, noting the easy friendship that had developed between them over months of interviews and shared coffee conversations. Thomas had been instrumental in helping Marcus navigate the bureaucratic maze of establishing legal identity after decades of deliberate invisibility, and his articles had generated enough interest to fund the Veterans Program through community donations. Speaking of love being complicated, Thomas said, catching Emma's eye with the expression that still made her pulse quicken. After 4 months of dating, have you given any more thought to my proposal? Which proposal? Emma asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. The one where you let me take you to dinner tonight at that new Italian place downtown, and we discuss whether you're ready to admit that this thing between us has progressed beyond casual coffee dates. Emma felt herself blushing, aware that Marcus was watching their interaction with the amused interest of someone who'd become protective of his granddaughter's happiness. I might be ready for that conversation. Good, because I've been working up the courage to have it for weeks, and Marcus threatened to lock me in the storage room if I didn't stop pacing around the bookstore like a lovesick teenager. I never said lovesick, Marcus protested. I said moony-eyed, which is entirely different and arguably more dignified. Thomas laughed, and Emma realized how much she'd come to love these ordinary moments of teasing affection between the people who'd become her chosen family. Her parents visited every Sunday, bringing David's children to spend time with the grandfather they'd absorbed into their lives with the adaptability that children brought to even the most unusual circumstances. Grandpa Marcus has the best stories. 8-year-old Sophie had announced after their first meeting. He knows about jungles and secret missions and how to fix everything that's broken. Some things, Marcus had corrected gently. I know how to fix some things. The rest requires patience and help from people who are smarter than I am. Now, watching Marcus guide another veteran toward books that might offer comfort or insight, Emma marveled at how healing could become a reciprocal process. Marcus had found purpose in helping others navigate transitions he understood intimately, while the veterans who attended his support groups had given him a community of people who didn't require explanations for the gaps in his history or the scars that didn't show. Emma, Thomas said, moving closer to the counter where she was processing new inventory. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, more complicated than dinner plans. Potentially. Thomas pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the same one he'd used during his initial interviews with Marcus. I've been thinking about expanding the Veterans Story Project, maybe turning it into a book. Stories of people who found ways to rebuild their lives after trauma, featuring Marcus's story as the central narrative. Emma looked toward Marcus, who was now deep in conversation with 3 different veterans about the relative merits of various memoirs and novels dealing with war and recovery. Have you talked to him about this? I wanted to talk to you first. The book would necessarily include your grandmother's story, your family's story. The way Marcus's return has affected all of you. I wouldn't proceed without everyone's consent. Emma considered the idea, thinking about Grace's letters hidden in Rose's house for 50 years, about secrets that had protected people, but also isolated them, about the power of stories to heal wounds that silence couldn't touch. I think, she said slowly, that my grandmother would have liked the idea of Marcus's story helping other people. She always believed that sharing our experiences was the best way to honor the people we'd lost and the struggles we'd survived. And you? How do you feel about your family's private business becoming public knowledge? Emma touched the locket at her throat, the silver surface worn smooth by decades of Grace's touch and now by her own. I think some stories are too important to keep private. Marcus spent 50 years believing he'd been forgotten, that his love for my grandmother hadn't mattered. Other people might need to know that love survives separation, that families can be rebuilt, that it's never too late to come home. Thomas smiled, and Emma realized she was falling in love with more than just his easy charm and genuine interest in other people's stories. She was falling in love with someone who understood that the most important narratives were often the ones that took generations to unfold completely. There's one more thing, Thomas said, closing his notebook and reaching for her hand. The book proposal isn't the only reason I wanted to take you to dinner tonight. Oh, I wanted to tell you that watching you with Marcus, seeing how you've created space in your life for someone who needed a family, observing the way you've turned your bookstore into a place where broken people can find the stories they need to heal. It's made me realize that I'm completely in love with you. Emma felt her heart skip in the way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Thomas, you don't have to say anything right now, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens between us, you've changed how I think about love and family, and the possibility of building something meaningful with another person. Emma looked around her bookstore at Marcus helping veterans find their way back to themselves. at the comfortable spaces she'd created for people who needed refuge, at the life she'd built around books and stories, and the belief that everyone deserved to find the narrative that would help them make sense of their experiences. "Thomas," she said, squeezing his hand, "I love you too, and I think my grandmother would have approved of you, even though I'm not a soldier or a war hero, because you understand that love stories don't always follow predictable patterns, and because you're willing to help other people tell the stories they need to tell." Emma smiled, feeling the weight of the locket against her skin and thinking about the long journey from Grace's first love to this moment of new beginnings. Besides, heroes come in all kinds of forms. Sometimes they're soldiers who sacrifice everything for duty. Sometimes they're journalists who help people find their voices. And sometimes they're granddaughters who learn that family can expand to include people